Oh, hello there. I'm Joe Bautista, and this is a continuation of my blog. The blog is called I Am a Low Carb Dieter. I don't have a well rounded personality because I go easy on the carbs. And this this is Benguet Pine Tree. And just in case you don't know, I'm also an enthusiast in doing bonsai. And this is my first pine tree, and I'm trying to bend the trunk so that I get the desired shape, which will make this tree look like a small old tree. Of course, I will be wiring the branches as well, and let's see. But I guess the order of business now is, of course, a continuation of episode 5 of our blog. And last time I was talking about fats and oils and how they go bad. And I think I was able to touch on the role of leptins. And I think in that blog, I told you that leptin has now become a very, very important hormone. And of course, leptin comes from adipocytes or fat cells, especially from the visceral fat that you have. But it can also come from other places like subcutaneous fat, fat from some of the joints, and even fat from the heart and the aorta. So when these places have fat cells, you expect that leptin, which is a hormone secreted by adipocytes, will come from these sites. And last time I think I touched on the multifarious role of leptins. And I think I also told you that, well, in my experience as a theriogenologist or a reproductive physiologist, I think I said that what I know of leptins, the role of leptins, basically encompasses the important role of leptins, which triggers the release of gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which is an all important hormone coming from the hypothalamus, which basically initiates or stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release the reproductive hormones such as follicle stimulating hormone and, of course, the other hormone, which is, well, it escapes my mind, but this is the topic that I've been probably lecturing for the past, let's say, well, I finished my PhD in 1998, so probably you can trace it back 5 years later. So let's just say that I've been talking about the roles of these hormones, GnRH, FSH, uh, and the other hormone which escapes my mind right now. I don't know. Maybe it's a problem of memory and senility. But I guess I will remember it later. Anyway, important to know that GnRH comes from the hypothalamus and that it basically stimulates the anterior pituitary gland uh, to secrete the hormones of reproduction like FSH or follicle stimulating hormone. Basically, follicle stimulating hormone, as the name implies, has a direct effect on the ovary, particularly on the growth and development of the follicles that are contained in the ovary since, even before the time you were born, if you are a female, uh, you already have that number of eggs, but primordial and primary follicles at that. And when you are born, the reproductive status is something of what we call the quiescent stage, or it's a quiet stage where no activity in the ovary is seen, neither is there an activity from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland to the gonads. Okay, no activity until the time before you reach the stage of puberty. Now, these are all under the initiation of the gonadotrophin releasing hormone. Of course, there are other hormones that are secreted that will support the basic functions of life. And what are these? We have growth, the growth function, as I said last time, the last blog. Growth hormone is a basic function of living organisms, and that in my lectures, I used to tell my students that, you know, all living things, all living cells have the ability to grow. And that's 100% sure. So, we define growth as that increase in the number of cells, or that it is in the in the size of the cell. That is growth. And it differentiates that capability of cells to either increase in numbers or increase in size, differentiates it from non-living things. Okay? Now, aside from that, so that is growth. And one other basic function of living organisms is development. So, what is basically development? Well, in layman's terms, development is actually that capability of the cell to specialize. Okay? Now, if you are to look at the history of the life of a cell, it is something like this. They begin with all of the capabilities of a cell. Okay? And it is even up to that point that that cell, when it reproduces, is capable of giving rise to a complete individual. That capability of the cell is called totipotency. Or, well, toti is something like encompassing the whole, as in total, and potency is that capability. But then, at some point in time, these cells, now when they reach that stage of development, they begin to specialize. They lose that ability to give rise to a complete individual, but they maintain that ability to be able to give rise to a complete organ. And this is different from totipotency in the sense that these cells that have specialized now are called pluripotent cells. So if you start from one pluripotent cell, there is a possibility that it will give rise to a complete organ. And all the organs in your body start that way. For example, if a pluripotent cell has developed and has been destined to become the kidneys, even if you take that pluripotent cell and culture it in the lab, it will, as long as the conditions are right, it will continue to divide and develop, multiply, and then eventually it forms a kidney. All right? So those are pluripotent cells. And it's the same for the other cells in the other systems of the body. Only at some point in time, for example, for red blood cells, they begin as pluripotent cells, but later in the development, okay, I emphasize development because it's different from growth, in the sense that, for example, red blood cells in mammals eventually lose the nucleus, so that even if in the beginning it is a pluripotent cell, eventually it loses that capability to divide. So that, as far as red blood cells are concerned, well, at some point in time, they have to be replaced. And where does the replacement come from? Of course, from your bone marrow, uh, especially the long bones, the bones in the ribs. So these are the sites where red blood cells are produced. So again, just to make it clear so that you don't get confused. So, in the development of cells, okay, we have a growth phase. And as I said, in the beginning, all cells are capable of growth, okay? And if during the growth phase they are able to multiply and then eventually give rise to a complete individual, and that is what we call totipotency. All right? But then, at some point in time after the growth phase, the cells begin to specialize. And when they specialize, they lose that ability to give rise to a complete individual, but maintain that ability to give rise to a complete organ. So it's the same, the skin, muscles, bones, the heart, or the vascular system, even the lymphatic system, and so on and so forth, undergoes the same phase or stages of development. So that is development. Now, uh, I think in the last blog, I told you about that special function of cells, which is not present in all, whether, whether it is from one system, for example, like you get a vascular system, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, excretory system, you know, these cells are specialized. All right. Now, there is one point after the growth and development phase when the function shifts to the pinnacle of being a living being, and that is reproduction. Okay? Now, in the phase of reproduction, what we can say is that not all living cells or not all living things have the capability to reproduce. Now, case in point, you have a colony of ants, you have a colony of bees. Which are of these members of the colony are able to reproduce? Probably in honeybees, for example, you only have the queen. It lays thousands of eggs, so she's capable of reproduction. And then you have the drones that mate with the queen so that the eggs that are laid are fertile. And of course, if these laid eggs are fertile, then it only means that after some point in time, the eggs hatch and then they give rise to larvae, and that these larvae become pupae and eventually they become the honeybees. Okay? And the same with ants. So, as I said, reproduction is a very special function. It's not present in all living things. And because it is a special function, I always kid my students like this. Look, all cells are capable of growth. All cells are capable of development, but not all cells are capable of reproduction. And it's the same for the individual. All individuals are capable of growth. All individuals are capable of development, but not all individuals are capable of reproduction. So, punchline, I kid my students. Well, if you think that you are endowed with the function of reproduction, don't waste it. Use it. And of course, I get maybe a few who laugh, but I think they get the point. Now, why am I saying this? Well, it has some connection with the role of leptins. So, leptins, as a multifarious hormone that affects almost all functions of the body, affect the three basic functions of life. So that you find the role of leptin in growth, you find the role of leptin in development or specialization, and of course, you find the role of leptins in reproduction. I think that's the easier way of, you know, tackling the role of leptins rather than enumerating all of the multifarious roles that are attributed to leptin, and more or less the viewer or you get lost in the discussion. Okay? So, with that strategy of defining the roles of leptin, okay, let's go to each one, okay? So that more or less, I know some of you are not, do not have backgrounds on reproduction, you do not have background on the life sciences like zoology, biology, and including animal science, even physiology. So, it would be easier for us to tackle the role of leptin in this way. All right? Now, leptin, the role of leptin in growth. Ah, okay. I think I mentioned some functions of leptin with regards to growth. And in the last blog, I think I said that as far as growth is concerned, leptin has a very important role in stimulating the cells to use up energy to support growth. Okay? So, what is this? Well, to support growth, you can actually classify leptin as pro-insulin. Okay? Why pro-insulin? Because insulin, as we've discussed in the previous blogs, has that growth, function that stimulates the cell to divide or maybe increase in size. And I think I said, I discussed, the pros and cons of the role of insulin in that way, in the sense that, of course, the main function of insulin is to regulate the high amounts of blood glucose so that, an equilibrium is reached when this extra blood glucose is stored as either glycogen or fat. And that is upon the stimulation of insulin. All right? Now, the release of insulin is affected by the release of leptins. All right? Or it's not only affected, but basically it is supported by leptin. So, the moment leptin is released by the fat cells in your body, it will stimulate the islets of Langerhans, in addition to the other stimuli. For example, what is that main stimulus? A high blood glucose level. All right? So, if there is a high blood glucose level, insulin must be released to be able to transform that extra blood glucose into a storage form. And if these cells that get this blood glucose are found in the liver, these cells are then stimulated to gather all of the glucose, package them into a storage form which is called glycogen. Now, in other parts of the body, so there is a high level of blood glucose in the blood, of course. It is collected by these cells that respond to the action of insulin and transform this extra glucose into fat. All right? And I guess I'm not sure now if it is episode 3 that I said the moment you fast or the moment that there is not enough circulating blood glucose as a source of energy for the cells, particularly the brain, the body will compensate by mobilizing its reserves, okay, like glycogen in the liver and like fat in the other parts of the body, and transform it back into glucose. Okay? So this is some way of reverse glycolysis. We call it glycogenolysis. When you have the glycogen in the liver that is transformed back into a simple sugar called glucose. So the process is a reverse of glycolysis, although it is part of the glycolytic pathway. But then, since it is stored in a complex form of chain carbohydrates, these are broken down into simple sugars back to glucose. Okay? And this is what we call glycogenolysis. All right? Now, if that stored carbohydrate is in the form of fat, okay, if it is in the form of fat, then you don't need insulin. All right? What is needed is another hormone, not insulin, but another hormone that also comes from the pancreas upon the stimulus of a very low blood glucose level. And that hormone is, of course, glucagon. Now, in the case of leptin, since we're talking of the growth phase, all right, we are talking of the growth phase, the moment leptin is released by the fat cells, it is antagonistic or against the release of glucagon. Why? Well, that is the effect of leptin on the growth phase in the sense that, it is pro-insulin, it stimulates growth. So it is something like, if leptin stimulates growth in the growth phase of cells and individuals, then there must not be a moment when that growth is sacrificed. And how is that sacrifice? Of course, when you have the reserves of the cell, you know, that are destined to be used for growth, and you take that out on the action of glucagon, what happens? Well, somehow the reserves suffer in the sense that this become almost depleted. Therefore, leptin will not allow that. Okay? So that leptin, the role of leptin is what we call anti-glucagon. You get it? So that is as far as the growth phase is concerned. Now, what happens in the growth phase? Probably you have already seen the events in the growth phase. And what is important for a growing individual is not just the tissues, not just the muscles in the growth phase, but also the frame. And what is the frame composed of? It's basically your skeletal system. All right? The growth of long bones is the easiest indicator of growth. So the faster your long bones grow, the faster the growth phase for an individual. Okay? And upon which stimulus does this happen? Of course, there is growth hormone, all right, or somatotropic hormone. There is insulin, and of course, not to forget, there is leptin. So, leptin supports insulin at this point. It probably or is expected to also support the release of the growth hormone so that it enhances the growth phase in individuals. It's not just cells, but the individual in general. Okay? So there is an important role of leptin in the growth of long bones. So, um, how do you hasten the growth in an individual? That should be a good question to answer. Well, it's like this. If the nutrition of a young individual is good, then you expect that the growth phase is fast. Okay? I repeat that. If the nutrition of a juvenile or a growing individual is good, you expect that the growth phase is well established. Okay? So that, what do you have? You have a young individual that grows tall. Also, the stature is a little bit wide. And that's what you get. Only if it is supported by proper nutrition. So, what does that mean? Well, if you do not get or you do not give proper nutrition to a growing individual, then the growth phase is somewhat stunted. Okay? And take note, because leptin comes from fat, you expect that those young individuals without a fat cover will definitely have a very slow growth phase. Okay? Now, what else? Of course, important if you consider the all environments, the factors that promote growth, then probably you will also come upon a function that promotes the security of an individual. Security in what? Well, it's protection from the environment, the ability to adapt, okay? The ability to withstand high temperatures, the ability to withstand low temperatures, and this is where leptin comes in. Leptin has a positive function on the growth of what we call brown fat. And what is brown fat? Basically, it's a layer of fat that serves as an insulation that protects the individual in very cold environments. So, you expect that aside from adaptation, well, it's part of adaptation, brown fat genesis is part of adaptation. But then, in animals and even in human beings that live near the poles, meaning in temperate as well as frigid zones, they need this layer of fat so that they can survive the cold temperatures and even the frigid winters. And take note, leptin has a direct effect on the deposition of brown fat, which ensures that the individual copes up with the environment. And if it is able to cope up with the environment, it can continue its growth until it reaches that stage of development where it begins to specialize, adaptation included. And then the next stage is that growth and development have led to the capability the individual acquires that function of reproduction so that it is able to reproduce, all right? And if it is able to reproduce, then it basically fulfills the ultimate function of life, which is to perpetuate its kind or the species. So I guess that's clear enough. Now, with regards to the next phase, and that is development, again, you see the important role of leptins. As I said, there are so many functions of leptin relative to development. For example, in the maturation of long bones, now remember, this is maturation. So it's not just growth, but the maturation of long bones. Leptin is very or plays a very important role in the sense that it is upon the stimulus of leptin where the long bones begin to be capped, you know. So in a growing individual, the cap of that long bone is not only composed of collagen, but that on the action of leptin, this collagen is transformed somehow into a cartilage or even into bone tissue. And what is the prime mover of this development? You guessed it. It's leptin. So, at this point, again, you see the very important role of leptin in the sense that, it supports development. Another case in point, I guess, after the growth phase, the individual has formed its frame. All it needs to do is, to put on weight so that the tissues begin to, enlarge. Muscles become, there is a differentiation between females and males. Like, for example, males will have more muscle, females will have, the development of muscles, but it goes with the deposition of subcutaneous fat. And again, which is the prime mover of this? Leptin. Okay? So that even in the differentiation between male and female, you still see that important role of leptin. Okay? Now, of course, maybe you go one, two steps ahead. You would say, okay, in the phase of development, why did you mention that males acquire more muscle and that females acquire muscle but with a layer of subcutaneous fat? Well, the simple answer is this. In the primitive stage of our evolution, males had to become very strong. Okay? And in addition to leptin, of course, there is an interplay of the sexual hormones, particularly testosterone in the male and estrogen in the female. But then, let's focus first on the male. So the male needs to build its stature, it needs to become strong to be able to compete. Why? Because in the wild, males need to compete with other males to acquire the right to mate with females. Probably you will ask, will it be the same for humans? Of course, it is the same for the primitive human. Yeah, it's like this. If, for example, you are asked of an image of a primitive human, a male, what comes to mind? Probably outside of Flintstones, you get a picture of, let's say, a Neanderthal or the hominids having what? A club made up of, I don't know, maybe stone or flint. And why do artists render that as the image of a primitive human or hominid? Well, simply because they have to compete. And as I said, it is very important to be able to compete and win if these males want to perpetuate their kind. You win, you get the right to mate. You lose, sorry, you lose your marbles. All right. Now, how about on the side of the female? And by the way, this primitive situation is also present in animals even up to this age. So, animals in the wild will have to devote a lot of time and energy to be able to prove who will acquire that right to mate with available females. Now, on the side of the female, not only does the stature increase, but that there is a deposition of subcutaneous fat, and that gives the idea or notion of maybe what we call beauty in the female. Now, other than beauty and vanity, it's something like this. If a female will put on a layer of fat, not only subcutaneous fat, but probably in other parts of the body, including visceral fat, then by the time it goes to the next stage of reproduction, there is enough reserves to support the growth and development of the gametes. And what are gametes? Well, basically for the female it's the egg, all right? For the male it is the sperm cell, and fertilization happens when the sperm cell is able to traverse the reproductive tract or the uterus and reach the fallopian tube, prepare itself for several hours, maybe 1, 2 days, until it acquires the capability to fertilize an egg, and then it gets to meet the egg, which is ovulated, of course, from the ovary. And on fertilization, the sperm cell enters the egg and, unloads the other half of the genes, which together with the counterpart in the egg will now join together to complete the genetic makeup of a new individual. And that individual will begin to grow, develop, so that from a single cell embryo or a zygote, it divides. Now, if when it divides, of course, you already have that phase of growth. Or the divided cells or daughter cells begin to acquire a bigger size. And that is growth. Okay? So, that's as far as what a simple explanation can be made. And again, if that is the case, then the species is assured that even if the generation dies, but because they have offsprings, then the species continues to survive. So isn't it beautiful? Life is beautiful. As I said, we go back to our main topic, which is leptin. Leptin definitely will have an effect on growth and development phase leading to reproduction. Now, as far as reproduction is concerned, the more important role of leptin is this, and it is the initiation of puberty. I think in episode 4, I mentioned something about the role of leptins with regards to reproduction, in the sense that I think I said sometimes we define puberty as that stage when the individual, growth phase has peaked and is about to end. The development phase is peak. It's on a slowdown, and that the next phase is, of course, the phase of reproduction. So, what is the important role of leptin in this case? Okay, the important role of leptin is that first, the individual must put on a deposit of fat somewhere. Either subcutaneous fat, but definitely there is visceral fat, and some fat in the aorta, in even the heart. Okay, and this is where the fat cells reside. So that you expect that when the proper conditions are met, these adipocytes will then release the hormone leptin. Leptin goes into the blood, okay, and the blood circulates all over your body. Some of that leptin goes into the brain. And the action of leptin on the brain is that it stimulates a type of neuron which is called the neuropeptide Y neuron, which is somehow found in the hypothalamus, and that, although it is not a direct initiator for the release of GnRH, it somehow mimics the action of the stimulus that generates the release of GnRH. Okay? Remember at this point, the quiescent stage, as far as reproduction in that individual is concerned, has not yet ended. It is still continuing, but that continuum is already towards the end. All right? So it is upon the action of this hormone leptin, which comes from the fat cells, that the initiation of the release of GnRH, which triggers the anterior pituitary gland to release these hormones of reproduction, like the follicle stimulating hormone, begins. All right? So, what is the implication of this? Well, the implication is that if the growth and development phase of an individual is retarded, particularly by poor nutrition, hardly does the individual reach that stage of reproduction. And if ever it reaches that stage of reproduction, it is already delayed. So what suffers? Of course, the ability to reproduce, the ability to support a pregnancy, for example, or the ability of sperm cells to be able to fertilize an egg, and so on and so forth. And all of this because of poor diets, poor nutrition, and of course, the scant release of leptins because of the scarcity of fat and fat cells in the body. All right? I think in episode 4, I mentioned that the amount of leptin that is found in the blood is directly proportional to the quantity of fat cells that are found in the body. Okay? So it's a basic information that you need to know. So that's how leptin affects all phases of growth, development, and reproduction in humans, including all of the phases of growth, development, and reproduction in animals. And that's how important leptin is. Now, how do you stimulate the production of leptin? Well, you have to satisfy that basic requirement. And what is that basic requirement? You need to put on fat. So I guess those dieters who follow a very strict regimen to lose fat better be careful because you might be losing a very important function that is supported by the deposition of fat. Think twice. Think thrice. Think four times. Fat is a needed element in your body because fat cells produce this hormone called leptin. And as I said, leptin is a multifarious hormone that affects all functions of the body from growth, development, up to reproduction. All right? Now, how easy can you get on fat to develop in your body? Okay, I'll repeat that. How easy is it to put on fat in your body so that it supports the function of leptin? Basically, it's about the diet. Nutrition is the most important stimulus for the deposition of fat. And as I said, it's very easy to put on fat. You have to overindulge in carbohydrates and you get fat, right? But then, you should do it only in the growth phase. Okay? It should be done only in the growth phase. So I refer back to I think episode 3 or 4 when I said that you need insulin or that positive role of insulin is found in growing individuals. But the moment you finish the stage of development and that you're already in that stage of reproduction, you're already an adult. You no longer need to, put on as much fat. Therefore, since you no longer need to put on as much fat, you also have to decrease the stimulus of insulin. And how do you decrease that? Well, you have to lower down your blood glucose levels. And in that way, if the blood glucose levels is maintained low, you expect that the release of insulin is lesser. And since leptin is pro-insulin, you will also have lesser releases of leptin. Okay? That's it. It's very simple. So, you need to put on fat at the growth phase and part of the development phase. But then, the moment you gain that mature stature and is now ready to undertake the role of reproduction, then you have to cut down on the factors, especially in the diet, to put on more fat. But, but, of course you need fat. Of course you need fat. So we've talked a lot about fat and fatty acids, good fats, bad fats, but that is now becoming extinct, that term good and bad fat. So what I can say is this, while probably in your adult life you don't need too much fat, and if ever you have deposited too much fat in your system, and probably you have to trigger gluconeogenesis to take out that fat and transform it into energy. And again, that's where the low carb diet, intermittent fasting regimen comes in. Now, you see the connection? Of course. So, in our adult life, we don't need that much of a high blood glucose level. We don't need that much stimulation of insulin. And what we need is basically a reduction of the fat reserves in your body. It can be used as a very good source of energy without requiring the releases of insulin and, of course, the releases of leptin. Okay? And in that way, you are able to control what are the diseases of the adult stage. Diabetes, type 1 and 2. You have cardiovascular diseases. Of course, you have arthritis, gout, rheumatoid arthritis, gouty arthritis. As a consequence of what I said in the beginning, you know, when carbohydrates or simple sugars are transformed into energy, particularly fructose, as a source of energy, you have that pathway. You have ATP reduced to ADP, further reduced to AMP, okay, and that releases, energy as a byproduct of the reduction. And unfortunately, that it doesn't stop at AMP, rather it goes through a pathway where from AMP, what comes next is UMP. All right? And what is UMP? It's uridine monophosphate. Now, what is the difference between UMP and AMP? Well, UMP contains, that I don't know about the proper term in chemistry. Okay, let's just say a side chain that contains nitrogen and uric acid. Okay, so that is an unwanted byproduct of the use of simple sugars uh, as a source of energy. Now, what do you need? Well, probably you need fats to provide that source of energy. So, if it is fat, in the first place, fat is deposited as the storage form of carbohydrates. So, it is transported back to the basic sugar glucose, but that it doesn't require the release of insulin, rather, it requires the release of glucagon. And since there is not enough supply of the simple sugar glucose from the blood vis-a-vis from the diet, then you don't need insulin. All you need is glucagon and the process of gluconeogenesis, and everything will work fine. Diabetics are saved from the agony of having to lower down their blood sugar levels. They won't need insulin because, as I said in the beginning, the repeated stimulation of insulin on the cells renders these cells resistant. So, the only positive role of insulin is, of course, in the growth phase. It supports growth. But on the other hand, in the adult phase, insulin will also support the growth of cancer cells because it has a growth function. And of course, we do not want that because most of the diseases that afflict humans come out at the adult stage. So you have diabetes, as I said, diabetes type 1, type 2, you have arthritis, you have gout, you have cardiovascular disease, and so on and so forth. So I guess that's for episode 6. And I'm happy that I was able to explain it to you uh, in, well, probably you can consider it a clear way. Okay, pardon me for waving my hand. This light here is activated by movement, so I have to wave my hand. Anyway, at this point, again, I thank you for bearing with me